Family and fellow soldiers, I'm the Professor, and this is the Moment of Truth. This morning's briefing might be a little off the beaten track, but stay with me. I may not necessarily be going where you think I am with this one. Robert Kyagulanyi Sentamu, famously known as Bobi Wine, is a Ugandan musician turned politician. Now here's my question. Who is supporting this man's political ambitions? You have an executive from National Geographic who calls this man a courageous African leader. Now, that ought to be 3 red flags for you. National Geographic did as much as anyone to pervert the image of Africans to the world. Yet here they are endorsing someone from over there. You think it's because he's trying to empower the African people? And this female executive from National Geographic also said that Mr. Sentamu, Wine, is committed to bringing democracy and equality to Uganda. Now, if you know anything about Uganda, you know that it was the Europeans who took democracy away from there in the first place. And you also know that the U.S. has never had democracy for a single instant, so how can any person from the U.S. pretend to say who or what is democratic and what is not? Also, when the Europeans were in charge of Uganda, they brought in people from outside the country, like the Indians, to be their white adjacent buffer group. Idi Amin used his position as Uganda's president to dislodge this effort at puppet colonization. There's a reason why in Britain people like Priti Patel and Suella Braverman, both Brahmin Indians, hate black people in general and Africans in particular with a passion. But as I've always told you, when you have some Negro who you never heard of, he just drops out of the sky, some clown you don't know the first thing about, and yet the white media is heaping praise on him, hyping him up, and making a big deal out of him, they're not attacking him, that should be your first clue he's a plant. He didn't come from the soil, because the white media ain't the black grassroots. Sentamu, Wine, has opposed General Museveni, the leader of Uganda since the 1980s. According to the white media, both Museveni and his son face potential charges from the International Criminal Court for alleged crimes against humanity. They made sure to put that in their piece. Well, that sounds horrible, doesn't it? You have a case of the typical African dictator and the International Criminal Court wants a piece of the guy. And while their accusations against him may well be valid, there's something that the white media never tells you. The United States is not, repeat, not a signatory to the World Court or the International Tribunal. The United States was key to setting up those organizations, and yet the U.S. has never handed over an American to it, and the white media never mentions that fact. I want you to think about that whenever the white media mentions that so-and-so is wanted by the International Tribunal or under investigation, that there's charges in the International Criminal Court. Just understand, the United States is not a signatory to it. And that should always be mentioned anytime they bring up the International Criminal Court. Because if the U.S. was bound to it, Henry Kissinger would have died in a cell and not as a free man. People like Oliver North, John Negroponte, who helped to organize and support death squads in Latin America during the 80s, these men have never been made to answer for their crimes. A large number of American governmental officials and corporate ne'er-do-wells would be in cages if the U.S. was subject to the International Criminal Court. So this is a perfect example of I'm white and I say so. Things like the ICC were set up for the tiny tyrants, for the Slobodan Milosevic's and the Saddam Hussein's, the tin-pot tyrants who don't have nukes and who the U.S. can knock off easily. But when it comes to the big tyrants and the big war criminals, people who have nuclear weapons, well, the U.S. twiddles its thumbs. So when the white media talks about so-and-so is wanted by the International Criminal Courts, just keep in mind, that means this is someone who's not playing ball. In my classic video, The Truth About Robert Mugabe, I gave you the rundown of African leaders who were supported by Britain and the U.S., who brutalized their citizens, commit all sorts of ghastly crimes, and yet the white media and the U.S. and Britain and other white countries have nothing to say about them. In fact, Britain and the U.S. give financial and military support to the most brutal leaders over there. There's a reason why the Brits are so fond of Rwanda. Go back and look at who was collaborating with the Europeans during colonization there, and then look at who the Europeans supported during the Rwandan War in the 1990s. So this is the white media cheerleading for regime change, trying to destabilize the internal politics of this country. If there's a genuine uprising of popular will, that doesn't need to be supported or encouraged from outside. All right, I can practically feel a number of you who are rolling your eyes or rushing to make comments saying, Professor, that's over there in Africa. It has nothing to do directly with us, so why are you presenting this as today's morning briefing? Because National Geographic has made a so-called documentary about Bobi Wine called Bobi Wine, the People's President. National Geographic announced that this documentary is set to be shown in select theaters over Martin Luther King Jr.'s holiday. So, a white media company has made a documentary about a man in Africa set to be shown on the birthday of a black American icon. This is a pathetic attempt to try to connect this tool to one of our genuine heroes. This wine character is not the president of Uganda. So why do they have a documentary calling him the people's president? Because that's what they want you to think the people of Uganda say about him. And they're already saying that this documentary has won a slew of awards. That's another train that's never late. Just keep in mind, when it comes to these awards, festivals, those things are rigged top to bottom. They already know who the winner is going to be before they're even shown. Just like the Oscars. Whether it be Precious or Last King of Scotland or Moonlight or any other white media propaganda, when they present movies with black people in it and the white media immediately starts saying it has Oscar buzz before it even debuts, when they start saying it's an awards contender and nobody's even seen it yet, they do it because these movies promote white power. This is how they credentialize their propaganda. They make it out as being authentic and worthy of belief. Awards are the white media's way of bestowing instant legitimacy onto things, and legitimacy in practical terms means truth. Black people didn't make this documentary or give it awards, so how can anyone be claiming that it's true at all? Now, you can say what you want about General Museveni or about Bobi Wine or about the internal politics of Uganda, but what I'm talking about is that this is the purest evidence that this man is not grassroots. He has a white media company making propaganda meant to get black people to support him, black people in the United States. It's no different than the phony documentary that billionaire Harlan Crow made to rehabilitate the image of his puppet, Clarence Thomas, or that whole Coney 2012 thing. This is the classic white power playbook. From Barack Obama to Bobi Wine, white power finds a puppet, puts big money behind him, and when he gets into power, he hands them the country on a platter and just ignores black people completely. And then, as things predictably get worse, the white media blames their own puppet, and they declare that black people can't govern themselves. When the reality is that the vast majority of the people the white media calls black leaders are nothing more than turncoat puppets, chosen, funded, and controlled by white power. Now, the white media is trying to make a false connection between this wine character and us, and it's no accident. But the reality is this is the reason we keep being maligned and attacked by black people from the Caribbean and Africa. Now, while not all the diaspora family are on the nonsense, the truth is a lot of them are. And for the ones who we see practicing this kind of idiocy, their antipathy towards us is rooted in jealousy. We have faced and continue to face brutality and oppression far worse than anything any other group of black people has ever faced. We're in the belly of the beast, and yet we ripped out one of the beast's ribs, fashioned it into a shank, and then cut our way out of that beast's belly. We then went on to do something that has never happened in all of human history. We, as a powerless and oppressed minority, have managed to define practically all the good things about this country. We have exercised disproportionate heft in that regard. From its good laws like the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments, to its good judicial rulings, to the good image that the U.S. has cultivated of being a colorblind meritocracy, false though it may be, the U.S. has spent the last 60 years using us as their front men for the propaganda that the U.S. has moved beyond race, and hence holds the moral high ground. You see, the U.S. does that because it's part of how the U.S. projects so-called soft power. Soft power means to influence other countries without having to resort to sending in the Marines. The U.S. used its media to push images and TV shows and movies to promote a phony image of the U.S. as one big happy family, a story of imperfect but undeniable progress. It was all a lie, of course, but the world believed it because they saw us being presented prominently in this propaganda. So there's a reason why when you have black people from the Caribbean and Africa see this, that the most oppressed and powerless people in the world manage to exercise disproportionate influence over the most powerful country in the world and manage to elbow their way into the national discourse. There's a lot of folks who are going to feel some kind of way about that because they realize that they're the majority in their own lands, but they've never been able to do what we did. They flee from where they are to where we are. You better believe that makes a lot of them feel some kind of way. So how do they compensate for these feelings of inadequacy? By attacking us and regurgitating all these white supremacist talking points against us. Because when people talk about Uganda, all they talk about is poverty or Idi Amin. Who is the Ugandan icon that people around the world know? If I named a Ugandan other than Idi Amin, would you even know that he was from Uganda? Black Americans are the face of global blackness, and we earned that position. We have represented the black race better than anyone else, and we know we have because all the black people from outside the U.S. compare themselves to us. They flee from where they are to be where we are. They don't compare themselves to any figure in Nigeria or Jamaica or Kenya or Uganda. We hear that so-and-so is the Malcolm X of Nigeria, or the Martin Luther King of Ethiopia, or the James Brown of Jamaica or the Virgin Islands. Desmond Tutu was compared to Dr. King or Jesse Jackson. When the Europeans talk about African immigrants in Britain or Germany or France or wherever, they always make direct comparisons to us. The comparisons never go in the other direction. Hell, before it's all over, I wouldn't be surprised if this Bobi Wine person started running around saying things like he's getting into good trouble or something. Oh. There's a reason everyone looks to us for trends and ideas. We are small in number, but we're enormous in impact. Never forget that. The Africans are more than capable of creating their own content and promoting it themselves. They don't need the white media to do it, and if the Africans don't do it for themselves, then they would be better off without any media as opposed to one controlled by their oppressors, which only exists to mislead them. One thing's for sure, a lot of people have swung off the coattails of our suffering, and off of the coattails of our valor, and tried to compare themselves to us. In Ireland, they compare the white guys who negotiated the IRA ceasefire to Dr. King. There's a reason you did not see black people from the diaspora in positions of high authority before we kicked open those doors. Without us, you don't get a Kofi Annan as UN General Secretary. People like David Oyelowo and others complain that in their native Britain, there's very few roles for black actors. Keep in mind, black people are only 3% of Britain's population. And the only reason that you see them is because U.S. global media has permeated the world and influenced how these foreign countries set up their own TV shows. As we as black people in the U.S. fought to be prominent on television, we also made it where it trickled down to black people in these other countries. Black actors in Britain are justified in wishing they could have more roles. But were it not for us, they wouldn't have the few that they've got. But I digress. My point is, when I see a white media company trying to make a false association between this guy and our icons, I gotta speak up on it. And you should too. This guy is not a Dr. King. And his name should not be anywhere near Dr. King's or any other of our heroes. This guy is much closer to a Bayard Rustin. Though the white media already knows that they tried to make Bayard Rustin into a thing and that fell flat, so they're having to go back to the tried and true. We should not be allowing any of this. We gotta remain on alert. The only way to safeguard the culture and the truth is to have people ready to defend it. Good day, and be one. I'd like to take a moment to mention some of our contributors. Burkett Cochrane, Morris Bodden, Rebellious Zoe, Jacques Hargett, and Gilda Dallas. Salute to them and thank you to everyone for listening, liking, and sharing this message. Black empowerment only exists because of you.